أيوة. الأرض إلنا والبلاد بلادنا والأرض إلنا والبلاد بلادنا على دلعونا وعلى دلعونا زيتون بلادي أطيب ميتونا وعلى دلعونا وعلى دلعونا زيتون بلادي أطيب ميتونا زيتون بلادي واللوز الأخضر والميرامي ولا ننسى الزعتر وكراس العجل لما تتحمر وطيب طعمتها بزيت الزيتون على دلعونا وعلى دلعونا زيتون بلادي أطيب ميتونا الخبز ملتوت وجبني طرية وأكل تدفينا بيها الشتوية وصحون السحلة.
Aroha ki runga, aroha ki raro, aroha ki roto, aroha ki waho. Tihei mauri ora. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi ki ngā mate o te ao. He mihi hoki ki ngā mate o Parihitini, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Ko Ariz Arab tuku maunga, ko Wairi Kharija tuku awa, ko Bishari tuku marae, ko Fakhri tuku iwi, no Lebanon, no Kotimana o ku tipuna. Ko Pamela Duff rawa ko Hana Fakhri o ku mātua, ko Anahira Irihau rawa ko Maya Ātiro aku kōtiro. Ko Moss te Urirangi Patterson tuku huarangatira i tipu ake a hau i Otipoti, kei titarangi a hau e noho ana, hei kai whakawhānau a hau, kua Annabelle Fakhri tuku ingoa, he tangata tiriti tēnei. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei wānanga ipurangi. Kia ora koutou, ahlan wa sahlan, and a 1,000 welcomes to everyone joining us for the second session of day 2 of Te Tiriti-based futures. For our international guests, the opening karakia was calling on love to envelop us so we can connect to the true life force. It was an acknowledgement of all those who have passed, particularly honouring the souls we have all lost in Palestine. Next, I spoke briefly about who I am through my piapiha, which acknowledged my ancestors from the mountains of Lebanon, the mountains of Bishari, Lebanon, and Scotland. My parents, my partner, and my children. I mentioned that I grew up in Otipoti, Dunedin, which is where I am today, that I live in Titirangi, where I work, and supporting the growth of whānau as an educator and a midwife. Then I introduced myself as Annabelle Fakhri, or Fairy, and acknowledged that I'm trying every day to keep becoming a person of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. We have some housekeeping slides, our community code, and I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the community code for keeping each other safe and ourselves safe in this online platform. Feel free to interact with the chat, share your thoughts and links in that space. It's a great way to keep us all connected. You can ask Nadia and Yasmin questions using the Zoom Q&A slide. And there's a moderator on hand that's facilitating our discussion behind the scenes. So thank you. And thank you to our tech people who are helping us. Welcome to Stories of Resistance in the Face of Settler Colonialism from Aotearoa to Parihitini or Palestine. Our speakers, some accessibility info, which helps you capture some live streams for social media, is showing now. Our speakers have asked to introduce themselves today. before we go on to them, just acknowledging our many, many partners and thanking their incredible generosity in making the information that we're sharing today free and accessible, as barrier-free as possible for the wide dissemination of our thoughts and ideas. You'll see how many people have been involved in bringing this webinar series to life. It's a true community enterprise, so kia ora. Nadia and Yasmin, our speakers today, have asked to introduce themselves, but I want to express just a few thoughts before I hand over to them. When I met Nadia Abou-Shanab and Yasmin Shiran, they enveloped me with hope, despite the horror of the last 162 days. Nadia and Yasmin are heroes of early education, unionisation and activism here in Aotearoa, all while passionately fighting for the liberation of their people and the survival of their culture in Palestine. It is this deep love of their own heritage that brings them into relationship with tangata whenua o Aotearoa. It is their own lived experience of great love and great loss, and their continued belief in humanity and our capacity for solidarity, collectivism and resistance that informs their profound appreciation of Te Mana o Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It is my absolute honour and pleasure to facilitate the session, where I know you will feel inspired by the power and the strength of their vision, wisdom and insights. Kia ora, Nadia, Yasmin. A million welcomes to you.
Tēnā koutou I te whānau, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Tuatahi e tika ana kia mihi ki te atua, nāna nei ngā mea katoa. Tuarua me mihi ki te kaikarakia I tēnei rā, tēnā koe, Annabelle. Ki te hunga mate kua whiturangitia, haere, haere, haere atura. Ki a tātou te hunga ora kua tai mai nei I tēnei rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ai au, no Parihitini te tūranga waiwai, I te taha o tōku papa, ko no Yafa ahau, I te taha o tōku mama, no Gaza ahau, ko Yasmin Sarhan tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. E tipu ake ana ki kirikiri roa, hei oi anō e noho ana au ki Tamaki Makaurau in INA. So tēnā koutou I te whānau. For our international manuhiri, I'd like to just address that I introduced myself with my pepeha and acknowledged the heritage of my dad. So Parihitini, Palestine, is my where I'm from. And from my dad's side, Yafa is the coast that I belong to, and from my mum's side, Gaza is the coast that I come from. I grew up in the Tron, in the mighty Waikato, and I'm based out in Tamaki Makaurau. And kei te hoatu te rākau kei a koe, Nadia, ko ai koe.
Ora Yasmin, tēnā koutou katoa no Parihitini me Airani o Kutipuna, ko Leeds te whenua tupu, kei Pōneke ahau e noho ana. Hei tangata tiriti ahau, ko Yasmin rātou, ko Elena nā tamariki, ko Nadia Abou-Shanab ahau, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, kia ora Annabelle, thank you for that beautiful opening. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, the heavy space that we are discussing this kaupapa in. When Heather reached out to us about a year ago, as you do with this conference, to invite us into this space, Yasmin was really keen to get me to do this. So just a bit of context for those of you who don't know, Yasmin and I worked together at Te Reo Roa, in Te Reo Roa, the Teachers Union, and I just want to acknowledge our colleagues who've made it on as well. I can see some of you there, kia ora. And Yasmin was trying to put me up to do this. And I really wanted to do this with Yasmin, because I think Yasmin should be in this space. So yeah, I want to acknowledge you, Yasmin, for putting me up to do this, and then for me dragging you into it and being willing to be in this space. But it was a different time a year ago when we were asked to do this, and we do it now in a context where we really have to acknowledge all those that are no longer with us. And I want to acknowledge all those here as well who have been victims or descendants of genocide, survivors of genocide, because I know there'll be others among us who are there. And I also want to acknowledge the mana whenua of this rohi in Pōneke, where I stand. So Tia Tiawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira and the Love Whānau as well. So kia ora, and looking forward to getting into this. Kia ora, everyone.
O ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Nadia. It really was such a different context. And I guess when we were originally thinking about how we want to hold the space, we were considering that not a lot of people might know about Palestine, and it'll be quite a different perspective that we'd be sharing. But today's kaupapa and the space that we'll hold will take the place of stories, pictures and videos that will illustrate the colonization of Palestine and the incredible and creative ways that resistance has met that colonization. The session will not be a historical list of events, so we're not going in chronological order, but it's divided into various themes of colonization, and then we'll offer the respective resistance that met that colonization. I hope that we've got some time to also address any Q&As. So Nadia will be feeding those through, hopefully, as we go along. So to start us off on our journey, I want to acknowledge that resistance and decolonization is the inherent struggle for self-determination. And the very first aspect of colonization we're going to touch on is land. So ke a koe, Nadia, if you can take us through our kaupapa of the colonization of land.
So we begin with land, and the reason we begin with land is because, you know, so often the story of Palestine is actually described as this land with these two peoples, and it's so often misunderstood on these terms, and I think even misrepresented, probably, I would say, as a war within this one land between two peoples, and that those two peoples are at war because they have two different cultures or two different religions, rather than a war for the land itself. So, you know, we know that colonialism is about that exploitation and control of resources and land, but we also know, if we think about settler colonialism, it's about all of those things too. But it's also a system of oppression that, you know, we know is based on genocide, it's based on colonialism, but it's also about displacing a native population, displacing and replacing a native population with a new settler population. And our story as Palestinians is one of a native population that lived on a land that came to be under British colonial rule. This land was then given away by the British to the Zionist project in 1917. And just to quickly define Zionist, because it's probably a word you've heard recently, and if you don't know what it means, it's about the idea of a homeland for the Jewish people, but that homeland be exclusively for the Jewish people. So a safe and exclusive safe haven for the Jewish people. And during, you know, the Holocaust and World War II, where Jews faced, you know, the culmination of 200 years of dehumanization in Europe, this idea was getting some rise, this idea of an exclusive, safe Jewish homeland. And there were other ideas. So other Jews were like, well, we should be able to fight racism and live wherever we may live. But yeah, that Zionist idea of an exclusive Jewish homeland in Palestine means that we are always not wanted there. And I think that we have to understand at the core of this project for a Jewish nation state, they will always seek to expel us. They will always seek to erase and cleanse us from the land. So I don't know whether people have heard this before, but we Palestinians often have this kind of saying, which has become a bit of a cliche in some ways, like existence is resistance. But I think, you know, in the last 5 months, that saying has kind of hit me in a new way, because I think what we see now in Gaza is a genocide and ethnic cleansing dressed up in the language of being a war to eliminate Palestinian resistance and Hamas. But when you murder 13,000 children under the banner that this is about crushing Palestinian resistance, you see how they understand Palestinian resistance to be even the mere criminal act of being alive as a young Palestinian. And they want us to know that there is no life for you in Gaza. That's why they've destroyed, 12 universities, nearly every school, and so on and so on. I could go on. But yeah, so just I guess just looking at this map, if you know that in 1917, the Jewish population, there's always been Jews in the area, this is true, and people will bring this up. There was a small, what we would call, I guess, a Palestinian Jewish population of a couple of percent. And in 1917, it was 6%. But by 1947, it was at 33%. In 1947, Jewish land ownership was 6.6% of historical Palestine. And the UN partition plan that was presented to Palestinians suggested giving them 56% of that land. So I'll just hand over to Yasmin now to talk about Al-Nakba.
Kia ora e hoa. And, just looking at this map without really derailing, but is very similar to the map of the colonization of Aotearoa. Ne? So Al-Nakba, for those of you, I'll start with the story of my grandparents. So in 1948, my grandparents heard about settlers that were expelling Palestinians from their homes in nearby towns and villages. And they truly believed that, if they're going to expel whānau from their village, they'll settle there, and then there's not going to be really a need for more settlers to come and occupy all these other spaces because they're just wanting a home, right? But the day arrived where my grandparents were forcibly expelled from their homes too. And it was at gunpoint, and they were given 5 minutes to take their belongings, and they were demanded to leave their home. My grandparents took what they could on their back, and some of the neighbors that were in their neighborhood tried to resist, and they got shot and their houses got burnt down. So my granddad was told that settlers moved into his home only a few days after he was forced to leave. And the saying that he used to say was "Akhaduha mafrusha," which loosely translates to "they took our home with all of its furniture." The loss of that ancestral land and that ancestral home that he grew up in meant that he grieved that loss till the day he passed away. It meant that every single day he said, "Akhaduha mafrusha, akhaduha mafrusha," and he never really recovered from that grief. My granddad, Allah yarhamah, passed away in 2008, and he was never able to return to Palestine since he was expelled. And bear in mind, he was in his 20s when this happened. So the quote that we've got on the slide is from the late Moana Jackson, and it really encapsulates what the loss of whenua means to those who are indigenous to a land. So when you take away the whenua from a people who regard themselves as tangata whenua, you take away their ability to literally touch the mountains. If you limit their ability to dream their own dreams, if you take away the earth upon which they stood with love, then you render them homeless in the most complete sense. The Nakba, or catastrophe, refers to the mass displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948. The stories of my grandparents' displacement, refuge, and hunger throughout the Nakba were stories, that my granddad passed on to me as we're kind of sitting around, me and my siblings and my cousins, while he's peeling some oranges, sharing that kōrero. But now with the ongoing genocide, with what's happening in Gaza, those oral narratives, those pūrākau, those lived experiences come with HD raw footage with what's coming out of Gaza. So I'm glad that my grandparents are not alive to have witnessed another genocide and to have seen the raw footage that's really coming out. And you may have seen in the previous slide about 750 to 800,000 Palestinians were displaced in 1948 from their ancestral lands. Aroha mai, I'm quiet. So There have been
Sorry,
many ways in which Palestinians have resisted against the separation that the colonial settler state has enforced on them, separating them from their whenua. And one of the acts of resistance that we wanted to share is something that's quite recent. So this action was called مسيرة العودة الكبرى وكسر الحصار, the Great March of Return in 2018. And this was a non-violent protest organized by the people who live in Gaza to protest against the illegal siege that was in place on Gaza. So for consecutive Fridays, starting from March 2018, tens of thousands of people gathered near the barrier or the border between Gaza and occupied Palestine. And just for some context, 70% of people who live in Gaza have been historically displaced from other parts of Palestine and relocated to Gaza from 1948 onwards. So the protesters were met with violence, guns, and intimidation by the Israeli occupational force. But people of all ages, I mean, you can see in this photo, people of all ages and many people dressed up in their best fits for this space. These tetas have got their thobes on, and this was very much a celebratory space. It exemplified self-determination through resistance. I want to share this photo that this baby hanging on who I assume is their father's shoulders or their relative's shoulders is fully dressed for this protest. They've also got in the background, you may recognize some of these world-renowned leaders who have organized their communities and led peaceful movements. So again, Indigenous people recognizing the work of other Indigenous people, creating peace and resisting colonization in their countries. There was a photo that really moved me, and it was that people would set up stages and have weddings during the protest. And this really just exemplifies the love that Palestinians have for resisting and the love that Palestinians have for continuing and for bringing another generation that will continue to resist. So I just want to really emphasize that through resistance, there are these acts of celebration of life that come to be. Nadia, kea koe e hoa, if you want to take us through water, the colonization of water.
Kia ora, Yasmina. I hope you as an audience are seeing a little bit about why we felt it was important to highlight these examples of resistance as well, because that story of the Great March of Return, like if you think about it, it's just not something we saw. You know, we did not hear about that on the news, and yet that was such a massive example of Palestinian non-violent resistance that continued for a year, that just wasn't reported on. So in terms of water, you know, it's an Indigenous idiom that water is life. And I think we all know that. We have our own water issues here in Aotearoa. But just to explain, like in the West Bank, and the idea of the West Bank for people who, you know, we're going back to the map, the idea of the West Bank and Gaza as these separate entities, which they shouldn't be, is that they were to form the home of a Palestinian sort of state, should that occur. They're supposed to be Palestinian land. But to understand that in the West Bank, Israel controls 80% of the water reserves. And, you know, both the West Bank and Gaza face severe water stress and drought. So for my whānau in the West Bank, you know, on every trip I've ever been there, running water would be something we would have some of the time and then not at other times. So I'm talking about the basic running water in your home would go off, and my family would need to use wells much of the time. So it's like this real having to be really conservative with water use, because settlers in the West Bank who live on illegal settlements, who live on our land, use 3 times as much water as Palestinians in the West Bank use. And what we see in the West Bank as well is the monopolizing and use of that water to actually grow really intensively, go to farm and to become rich from the land. So you've got illegal settlers producing wine, you've got vineyards that producing these olive oils, dates that are shipped out to the world and said as produced in Israel when they're produced illegally on settled land. And, you know, that the Palestinian farmers who are watching this wealth be extracted from the land that is actually theirs, sometimes don't even have drinking water in their own homes. Another thing just to note is like that the sewage, so we've heard recently obviously about what happened in Gaza and the issue of water in Gaza and during this genocide, but to understand that Israel has a long history of destroying Palestinian water infrastructure. So here in Pōneke, obviously we've got lots of water infrastructure issues, but you're talking about a regime that's come in and actually deliberately destroyed sewage plants, destroyed piping in the West Bank. Anything that kind of gives Palestinians any form of water infrastructure has been destroyed. On the basis that Palestinians don't have permits. And a lot of stuff is done under the rubric of Palestinians not having permits or permission to do stuff. So that is part of what leads to those water issues. And in Gaza, you know, and Yasmin's going to talk a little bit about fishing, but, you know, fishing was once a really productive livelihood for many in Gaza. You're talking about a coastal enclave, and, you know, the market of fish is one of the main sources of income for lots of people in Gaza. But it's now near impossible to fish because the blockade for the last 17 years has prevented people from fishing further than 6 nautical miles out of Gaza. And even when they do that, even when Gaza fishermen go out on their boats, they are shot at, injured, and threatened, you know, and killed for just actually going into their waters and being able to fish off the coast of where they live. So, you know, I think Yasmin's going to talk a little bit more about fishing. But yeah, just to note, I guess, that even before this current genocide in Gaza, only 1 in 10 households in Gaza had direct access to drinkable water. So there's an enormous amounts of destruction that have gone on there. Yes.
Kia ora. Kia ora e hoa. Thank you for acknowledging that. And, you know, the cutting off of water, of drinking water in Gaza was one of the first things that took place at the beginning of the genocide. So again, it's like a direct attack on access to life. So Nadia acknowledged that Gaza has one of the longest coasts along the Mediterranean out of all of the occupied Palestinian coastal cities. And living next to the coast, you're bound to be inspired to different practices around fishing and netting, etc. So there were ancestral fishing practices that the people of Gaza embodied, and they were celebrated and they were preserved. And like the fisherman is literally one of the top celebrated professions and has been for many generations. Fishermen practiced the hand threading of their fish nets, and the skill of doing that is something that's passed on from generation to generation. And during their routine fixing or maintenance of those fish nets, you often see, you know, elderly people with younger people, sort of that tuakana taina model, and the knowledge of how to create those fish nets with your hands, basically, is something that's passed on from generation to generation. And the Israeli restrictions on boat size and motor engine and the number of people that are out in the sea and the distance from the shore that Nadia acknowledged before meant that people could use, or people resisted that by using their ancestral knowledge of creating those fishing nets that don't require them to go out as much as, go out to the point where the siege basically starts. And I also want to acknowledge that people going out to sea for fishing are at risk of being shot at any point, whether they are actually within the limit of where Israel has banned them or not. But those ancestral practices of hand threading and being together and keeping that knowledge within the family means that you've got families that have been doing this for like hundreds of years. And then these photos that I wanted to share with you were a grandma who was going to the beach for the first time since she was 8 years old. So if you recall the map that we shared at the beginning of the session, people in occupied Palestine, in the West Bank specifically, have been cut off from direct access to the sea. And this experience, this is a grandma who used to live on the coast of Jaffa, where my grandparents and my parents are from. And this was her grandson who took her to the sea for the first time in 70 years. So I'm going to read a quote that he shared. His name is Ziad Khadash. And sorry, it was his auntie, not his grandma. I just call her grandma, but Auntie Halima. So she took her shoes off, played with the waves like a kid. She stared long at the sea. Strange words dropped from her mouth, and I didn't understand a word. Every time I asked her, "What did you say, Aunt?" she would say, "Nothing, dear, nothing, dear." In the car on our way back to the refugee camp, she told me and Tariq Bakhri, "Why didn't you leave me a little longer by the sea, dear ones?" Tariq cried, and I was silent. So for those of you who don't know, most young Palestinians have never seen the sea, have never been in touch with the Moana. The sea is owned by Israel, and occupied Palestinians need special permits to leave where they are currently, need special permits to access the sea or such areas. And it's really hard to be able to get access to a permit. So the only other beach that Palestinians have direct access to was in Gaza. And Gaza is besieged. So if you're in the West Bank, you can't get to Gaza. And if you're in Gaza, you can't go to the West Bank. And most Palestinians don't carry passports, so travel and movement is severely obstructed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the part about prisons and checkpoints, etc. But I just really want to sit with this moment of reconnecting with Moana, or reconnecting with the sea after years of not being able to do so. It inhibits our way of life. So that deliberate cutting off of people from access to the land and access to the sea is only exemplified through the Israeli law and prison system. So checkpoints are a way in which Palestinians are restricted from moving between their villages, and up to 70,000 Palestinians have to go through checkpoints every single day in order to access workplaces, in order to go to hospitals, in order to go to school. So you've got kids that are waiting in line, and there's no saying how long or how short your stay is going to be. One of my Pākehā friends recently went to the West Bank and was absolutely mortified as she waited through the queue, and they would put her in the front, and she witnessed a pregnant wahine being pushed to the back of the line every single time she made it to the front. So that's quite a common experience for people going through these checkpoints. In terms of, so these checkpoints, the prominent goal of them is to have control over Palestinians' movement in their daily life. 40% of Palestinian men have experienced Israeli detention, have been in Israeli detention. And the common thing that is known is that Israel takes on this practice of administrative detention, which is essentially putting people in prison without a trial, but under the basis that they may commit offense in the future. And if you're under administrative detention, there is no saying how long or how short you can stay in prison. And what we've seen is that this administrative detention also applies to children. So Israel is currently the only country in the world that imprisons children, and an estimated of 10,000 Palestinian children have been held in imprisoned children under military detention. And they've imprisoned 10,000 Palestinian children over the last 20 years. And then one of the other things that we also wanted to touch on in terms of these colonial practices is the use of solitary confinement. We identify that solitary confinement is the deliberate and most intense form of dehumanization of Palestinians that is possible under Israeli occupation. So it's absolute disconnection from, the sky, the earth, people. We are a people that thrive on our community and thrive on our ability to connect with other humans. So I might pass on to you, Nadia, to talk us about the metaphor of prisons for Palestinians?
Yeah, so I guess we'd had this whakaaro, hadn't we, Yasmin, about, we talked a lot about our family coming from different places within Palestine and that separation that Palestinians experience. So you might have been carved up into the West Bank, you might have been carved up into Gaza, or you might have been scattered to Naho Efa and become a refugee in the diaspora. But one thing we all experience, I think, as Palestinians is this separation from land and sometimes from our whānau and from each other through these walls, these checkpoints. I mean, if you think about actually Gaza, it's important to note there was a fence around Gaza, well, a security fence, but basically what you're talking about is a huge wall which entrapped people. We often described Gaza as an open air prison. And I think, Angela Davis, many of you will be familiar with her, she's an abolitionist, American thinker. And what she talks about is prisons as this way to disappear social problems, as this way to disappear people. And I think at the use of Israeli detention and also the walls, the gates, the fences, as a way to disappear the Palestinian problem, as far as Israel's concerned. That architecture is there to keep us locked away, so that they don't have to worry about us. And just to acknowledge, I guess, that, before October 7th, people in Gaza were, I think, as far as Israeli society, were kept somewhere. They had a high enough fence and they wouldn't have to deal with the fact that they had a starving, besieged population behind those fences, because the fences were high enough and strong enough to keep them out. So just to acknowledge that. And then I guess to go to the resistance to prisons and law. I mean, there's lots of that. I mean, it's actually illegal under the military rule in the West Bank for 10 or more Palestinians to gather and talk about politics. And try find 10 Palestinians gathering right now and not talking about politics. So that resistance to those laws and to that occupation is a daily thing. Just want to briefly mention that, hunger striking within prisons is a huge practice for Palestinian political prisoners. It's been one to use to fight that thing called administrative detention, which is what Yasmin mentioned. So you can be arrested in Palestine and held for 6 months without charge, and that can be repeated indefinitely. And so prisoners began to organise and fight their treatment through the practice of hunger strike in 1968. The first hunger strike was prisoners getting together, and they wanted to organise around the issue that they were made to call the Israeli prison guards Yasidi, which means our master. And so they did their first hunger strike around that. They won around that issue. It was about using the body as a battleground, and then they proceeded to have strikes around getting mattresses, pencils, and books so that they could write. And there's been a huge education project within Palestinian prisoners, among Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention, using that time behind bars to read, to learn, to do everything they can to free themselves. And, I guess one of the things that we want to talk about was the release of prisoners, right, Yasmin, and how one thing us Palestinians say is that when you're released from Israeli detention, you go from the small prison to the big prison. And I'll hand over to Yasmin now.
Kia ora e hoa. And so, the release from the small prison to the big prison is freedom. Even in the smallest of capacities, it's freedom, and it makes for the greatest of celebrations in Palestinian resistance against settler colonialism. So when a family is informed, if they're lucky, of course, they get informed, but when a family is informed that their child is going to be released from prison, the whole neighborhood is decorated, and often sweet shop owners come and provide sweets to the family to celebrate the return of their child. And all of this celebration is illegal, of course, under Israeli occupation, but the joy of welcoming whānau back after they have been under illegal administrative detention is worth the risk. And it's recognized as a step closer to a free Palestine. I wanted to share with you just a couple of things here. This kupu, sumud, is used within the Palestinian cultural and political context as a value in which there's perseverance and there's steadfastness and there's resilience. And so this word has really come up, especially in the last 5 months, but has always been used to describe the value of resisting for a long period of time. And going hand in hand with that, I wanted to share this waiata that is sung by, or one of the clever ways that Palestinians use to inform their whānau in prison that someone's going to get them out. So this is, I'm really excited to share this. This is one of my favorite forms of resistance. Hopefully the captions are clear enough, so I'm just going to press play.
الأغنية كان يغنوها النساء الفلسطينيات لما يروحوا يزوروا أحبتهن في السجون حتى يقولوا لهم رسالة إنه الليلة الشباب رح يحرروهن من السجن، فكانوا يضيفوا حرف اللام لحتى يموهوا السجان وما يعرفش إيش الرسالة اللي بدها تصل. بحب أرفع يا طالعين إلى كل الأسرى والمعتقلين الفلسطينيين والعرب في سجون الاحتلال، حرية إلهن. يا طالعين عين الجبل يا مول الموقدين النار بين اليمن يمن عين الهنا يا روح إلا غزالين اللي ذي جوين اللي كم يدوم بين اليمن يمن عين الهنا يا روح يا طالعين عين الجبل يا مول الموقدين النار بين اليمن يمن عين الهنا يا روح.
This is Reem Benna. She's a Palestinian singer, so check her out on Instagram. Well, that's where I found that particular video, but you know, just clever ways of playing around with language and going near the prison to sing out as a community to the people that are in prison so that they know to be ready and prepared that someone's going to get them out.
الأغنية كان يغنوها النساء الفلسطينيات.
Kapai. So just moving along into the next theme of colonization, kaya koe Nadia. Kai, food.
Yeah, we're going to whip through this one because we're kind of coming to a close now, but it would be remiss of us not to mention food. I guess just to briefly explain how colonization impacts food, even though I think we intuitively know it. Well, we know during this Gaza genocide that people in Gaza are facing the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status that's ever been recorded. And that means children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. But I think when we think about the background of who Palestinians are, which is a largely agricultural people, you see the way that dispossessing people from their land and their means to live off that land impacts so many elements of their health, their well-being and their nutrition status, even before you get to a point like what's happening right now. You know, there's a lot we could say on this, but I think the picture of burning olive trees says a lot. I was going to talk a little bit about my family and our olive trees, but I think we should just head straight through to food as a form of resistance. Hey, Yasmina.
Hi. So just acknowledging what you shared, Nadia, that the forced displacement of people meant that they no longer had access to their ancestral foods, their ancestral rongoa, their traditional medicine. The siege on Gaza, first of all, has meant that there's additional foods that are banned from entering, things like cardamom, things like coriander, things like chocolate. And so I might be biased in saying this, but one of my favorite traditional dishes, Palestinian dishes, is maqluba, which means upside down. Google it after this. And I think the best maqluba from Palestine comes from Gaza. And although they've got the least ingredients and the least direct access to the traditional ingredients that they would have had, they have been so creative with how they've recreated maqluba, and it's so unique. And there was a video that was shared by Mu'taz Azaiza, one of the journalists that was covering what was happening in Gaza throughout the genocide, where his mum made do with whatever ingredients she could find and made maqluba, and he invited all his friends together. And it's a dish that is made for the collective, for a group. You don't make maqluba for yourself. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as one of the forms of joy and love and resistance that Palestinians strongly identify with. And then one of the other things that I also wanted to acknowledge was Vivian Sansour, who established an heirloom, or she founded the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library as a way of resisting Israeli commercial agribusiness. So reviving those lost heirloom crops and forgotten ancestral foods, because there's a deliberate act of trying to remove Palestinians' ability to harvest their own crops. And these traditional seeds are self-sustaining. And so that means that farmers and Palestinian farmers it's a deliberate attack on their self-sufficiency to be able to do their ancestral work as farmers. Right? So the seed banks, check them out as well as one of those forms of Palestinian resistance.
يلا بسم الله لا مشيت يلا
لازم كلكم تطبلوا عليها على فكرة.
طبل أمنيتي هذا العام
بسم الله الله.
Aroha mai to those of you who are fasting. Aroha mai. So just in terms of our time, Nadia, do you want us to have a quick talk through the act of colonizing culture and what that looks like? And then maybe we can jump into our reflections. Aye?
Yeah, kia ora. So I think the thing on culture that I'd say, some people bring up cultural appropriation as a core issue for us as Palestinians. You know, you see how sometimes Israelis steal our food and whatnot. But I guess the point that I wanted to make here was just around the systematic imprisonment, murder, and stifling that goes on of our forms of Palestinian cultural and political expression. And so there you've got this meme of Zareen Tatur, who is a Palestinian poet who was actually jailed for writing a poem. And I think, you know, that's just a quick whakaaro that I wanted to leave you with. It's not just about the stealing of those forms of cultural expression, it's also about the stymieing of them through the use of the prison system, through actually, you know, murdering these people deliberately in a targeted way. You'll have heard about the deliberate murder probably of Rafat al-Ghaliya, the Palestinian scholar and writer and poet who wrote the poem If I Must Die. In Gaza, you know, he was deliberately targeted and murdered, I think, because he was a cultural leader. And so, yeah, I'll hand over to you, Yasmina, on that resistance through culture.
Kia ora, Ehua. So one of the main forms of maintaining a connection to whenua and maintaining the memory of what our connection to bodies of water and hills and people and our places where we came from take art forms such as tatriz. So tatriz is embroidery in Reo Pākehā in English, I think, embroidery. And it was practiced by mostly our wahine who wanted to preserve the images of those places, of the villages that they're expelled from. And so there's like different forms of traditional tatriz for people that come from different parts of Palestine. So they're quite identifiable. You can see I'm wearing a tob that's got some tatriz on it, and it's a modern one, so it's a blend of a few different cities. But tatriz is one of those forms of maintaining the images of the land that would now look completely different because new cities have been built on them. And then the other form of resistance that I also wanted to share with you is obviously our poetry. So I hope you are, Nadia, I'm going to read this in Arabic, and you've got the English translation that sits with it, but it feels right to share Hamoud Darwish's kōrero in the language that he wrote it. So it'll start here and then here and then here. Ka pai? على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة تردد إبريل رائحة الخبز في الفجر، أراء امرأة في الرجال، كتابات إنسيليخيوس أول الحب، عشب على حجر، أمهات تقن على الخيط الناي، وخوف العزى من الذكريات. على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة، نهاية أيلول، سيدة تترك 40 بكامل مشمشها، ساعة الشمس في السجن، غيم يقلد سربا من الكائنات، هتافات شعب لمن يصعدون إلى حتفهم باسمين، وخوف من الطغاة من الأغنيات. على هذه الأرض على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة، على هذه الأرض سيدة الأرض، أم البدايات وأم النهايات، كانت تسمى فلسطين، صارت تسمى فلسطين، سيدتي أستحق لأنك سيدتي أستحق الحياة. I'm going to just check in to see how we are with time, if we have some space to have some final reflections.
I think we close up. Close up now. I checked the Q&A. Yes, Mina, we had a couple of questions. One which was on what people can do, and I think that one we can do later. One on the role of the Jewish community, which again I think we can reply where we won't need to resist. And so I wonder whether we just close up with a final reflection each, Yasmina, and then hand back to Annabelle to close us up with a karakia and clear the way.
Kia ora.
So, okay, well, just to share my reflections, I guess, I want to acknowledge everyone who's participated in the chat. There's been a lot of activity, and just a big kia ora to you all for drinking it all in. And I hope that you got something out of it. For us, I guess we wanted to acknowledge the role of Māori solidarity with Palestine, which we've witnessed, whether it's been like in physical spaces like at Tūranga Waiwai or at Waitangi, where Palestinians were just embraced and enveloped by the manaakitanga that exists within Te Ao Māori. But I think I've been thinking about what is it about the Māori solidarity with Palestine that gives me hope. And I think what it is getting to witness Māori be Māori on their own land, but also understand our role as tangata tiriti, has been making me think how possible it is for two people to actually live together, as far away as that might feel right now with the way that the Crown is behaving, that it is possible for two peoples to live together respectfully and in partnership, and to respect the rights of Indigenous people to be self-determining on their own land. And we're not there yet, but I think there are many tō iwi and Pākehā who want to live up to that promise of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I want to be one of those people, but also I think that because it gives us a roadmap. We've come from a place where two peoples have ended up in a deeply harmful relationship with each other. And I think that's what colonization does. It's a deeply harmful relationship between two peoples because it's one based on domination. So I want to acknowledge Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the promise that it gives us, and to acknowledge Yasmin for all you've shared today as well. I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora e hoa. I want to tautoko that as well, and the whakaaro that I want to leave with is that, number one, yes, every Palestinian sees that there will be an end to this. The sumud, the concept of sumud, is something that we're born with, is something that's passed on to us, that it's not really easy. There's no alternative. We can't be all wiped out, you know, and we are the moko, the grandchildren of the ancestors that they've tried to assassinate and they've tried to expel and they've tried to displace, but we're here and we're stronger, and each generation is even more equipped to deal with colonization. But I just want to hold on to how being on this whenua, being amongst tangata whenua during this current ongoing genocide has been such a healing way to see how a community can come together, and how that cross Indigenous solidarity is important in reminding us who we're up against, but also how we can make change possible. So my final whakaaro is to toitu te tiriti, listen to Indigenous people. No one knows their colonizer more than those who have been colonized and are putting in the work to undo it. So I always will trust my tangata whenua and hope to uphold the promise of te tiriti till the day, basically, that I depart this world. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We'll hand back over to you, Annabelle, but thank you so much for all the pātai. We will have access to these pātai later, and Nadia and I will do our best to respond to you. So ngā mihi nui ki a koutou.
Ngā mihi nui, sorry. Am I unmuted? Yes. Ngā mihi nui, Nadia. Ngā mihi nui, Yasmin. There's just so much love pouring through in the chats for both of you, for your bravery, for your schmoot. Is that how it's said? Your resistance, and in the face of these extraordinary times is profound. You've brought us so much to reflect on today, and I know we'll all go with visions of victory for Palestine in our hearts, as we see their tenacity, their resistance, and their continued aroha, faith, love, and joy that they bring into the spaces of their oppression, which came through so beautifully in your kōrero. The chat, there's just too much to read out. There's lots and lots of just thanks to you both from the community, and everyone is obviously feeling really, really buoyed by your words. And so I'd like to finish us off now with a karakia, just reminding us that we have access to this as a live recording to share widely. Thank you to our crew, Anne and Ray in the background, and our facilitators helping us with this session. Go well, everyone. Kia tau te rangi Mārie, o te rangi nui e ta iho nei, o papa tōnuku e tukoto nei, o te tai ao e awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou, tihei, mauri ora, kia ora, ka kite anō.